Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Before we dive into tonight's journey through one of history's darkest chapters, I want you to get comfortable, dim the lights, settle into your favorite chair, and prepare yourself for a story that's been sanitized in textbooks for centuries. If you enjoy these deep dives into the shadows of the past, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love connecting with viewers from all corners of the world. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on the Black Death, that medieval nightmare that swept across Europe like a tide of darkness. But here's the thing. Everything you think you know about this pandemic is probably wrong. The sanitized version they taught you in school barely scratches the surface of what really happened between 1347 and 1351. We're talking about secrets so disturbing, so bizarre, and so human that historians have spent centuries either ignoring them or burying them in academic footnotes. This isn't just another retelling of how many people died or which trade routes spread the disease. We're going deeper. We're exploring the psychological horror, the social collapse, the desperate measures people took to survive, and yes, the absolutely insane theories about what was causing this apocalyptic event. By the end of this series, you'll understand why the Black Death wasn't just a disease, it was a complete unraveling of medieval civilization. So buckle up, because what I'm about to share with you will change how you think about pandemics, human nature, and survival forever. Let's start with something they definitely didn't teach you in school. When the Black Death first arrived in Europe, people had no idea what they were dealing with. Imagine waking up one morning to find your neighbor covered in black, oozing sores, delirious with fever, and dead by sunset. Then your other neighbor. Then your family members. This wasn't a gradual epidemic. It was an explosion of death that moved faster than anyone could comprehend. But here's where it gets really dark. The first reaction wasn't medical, it was supernatural. People genuinely believed the world was ending. Not metaphorically, literally. They thought God was cleansing the earth, that the apocalypse had begun, and that normal rules of society no longer applied. This belief led to some of the most disturbing human behavior in recorded history. In the Italian city of Siena, as bodies piled up faster than they could be buried, something extraordinary happened. The social fabric didn't just fray, it completely disintegrated. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Families abandoned their own children. People broke into homes of the dead, not just to steal, but to hold grotesque parties among the corpses. Contemporary accounts describe scenes that sound like something out of a horror movie. Wealthy merchants dancing in silk robes while surrounded by rotting bodies, convinced that indulgence was the only rational response to certain doom. This wasn't isolated madness. Across Europe, the psychological impact of the plague created what historians quietly call mortality cults. These were groups of people who became obsessed with death, not in a morbid way, but in a celebratory way. They believed that since death was inevitable and imminent, the only logical response was to embrace it completely. They would gather in cemeteries, hold feasts on gravestones, and perform elaborate rituals designed to welcome death. One of the most chilling examples comes from a monastery in Bavaria. When the plague reached their walls, instead of praying for salvation, the monks decided to document every single death in graphic detail. They created what can only be described as a death diary, recording not just who died, but how they died, what their last words were, how long they suffered, and what their bodies looked like in various stages of decay. The surviving pages of this manuscript are so disturbing that most historians won't even quote from them directly. But perhaps the most shocking secret of the Black Death is how it revealed the complete inadequacy of medieval medicine. You've probably heard about the plague doctors with their beaked masks, and yes, they existed. But what you haven't heard is how utterly clueless they were. These weren't brave medical professionals fighting against impossible odds. Many of them were complete charlatans, who saw an opportunity to make money from desperate people. The medical treatments they prescribed weren't just ineffective, they were torture. Picture this. You're already suffering from fever, swollen lymph nodes, and delirium. The plague doctor arrives, dressed like a demonic bird, and his solution is to slice open your swollen glands with a dirty blade, drain the infected fluid, then stuff the open wound with a paste made from crushed emeralds, mercury, and human excrement. If that doesn't kill the infection, surely bleeding you until you pass out will balance your bodily humours. One particularly disturbing account from Florence describes a plague doctor who became convinced that the disease could be cured by transferring it to animals. He would bring live chickens, pigs, and dogs into sick rooms and press them against the buboes of dying patients, believing the animals would absorb the pestilence. When the animals inevitably died, he saw this as proof that his method was working. When the human patients also died, he blamed their lack of faith. The really dark secret here is that these medical practitioners often knew their treatments were useless. Surviving letters between plague doctors reveal a cynical understanding that they were basically performing theatre for desperate families. One doctor wrote to his colleague, "The people require ceremony and confidence more than cure. Give them elaborate rituals and expensive medicines, and they will pay handsomely even as they die." This brings us to one of the most disturbing aspects of the Black Death, the complete breakdown of trust in authority. When it became clear that nobles, clergy, and physicians had no special protection or knowledge, people stopped believing in the entire social order. If a bishop could die just as horribly as a beggar, what was the point of hierarchy? If expensive medical treatments were no more effective than folk remedies, why trust educated experts? This crisis of authority led to some England. The Peasants' Revolt was one of the most violent social upheavals in European history. It ain't just about taxes. It was about the fundamental question of why some people deserved to live in luxury while others died in squalor, especially when death was proving to be such an equalizer. The revolt was brutally suppressed, but the psychological damage was permanent. People had seen behind the curtain, and they would never fully trust authority again. The plague also revealed something deeply uncomfortable about human nature, our capacity for both extraordinary selflessness and horrifying cruelty, often in the same person. There are accounts of mothers who died caring for their infected children, then stories of those same communities abandoning entire families at the first sign of illness. Priests who gave last rites to dying plague victims, knowing it meant certain death, then other clergy who fled their parishes and left their congregations to die without spiritual comfort. One of the most haunting examples comes from a small village in England, where the local lord, seeing that the plague was approaching, made a terrible decision. He ordered his soldiers to seal the village gates and post guards to prevent anyone from leaving. His reasoning was that if the plague was contained to one place, his other lands would be safe. The villagers were essentially sentenced to death to protect his economic interests. What makes this story even darker is that it probably worked. The plague burned through the sealed village in a matter of weeks, but his other territories remained largely untouched. These weren't isolated incidents. Across Europe, communities made brutal calculations about who lived and who died. Quarantine wasn't a medical intervention, it was often a death sentence. Families would wake up to find red X marks painted on their doors by authorities, marking them for isolation. Guards would be posted to ensure no one left. Food would stop being delivered. Essentially, entire households were left to die slowly of starvation and disease. The psychological impact of these measures was devastating. Survivors often developed what we might now recognize as severe PTSD, but medieval society had no framework for understanding or treating psychological trauma. Instead, many plague survivors exhibited behaviors that contemporary accounts describe as madness or possession. They would experience violent nightmares, refuse to enter enclosed spaces, or become obsessed with cleanliness to the point of injuring themselves. What's really chilling is how quickly these extreme behaviors became normalized. Within months of the plague's arrival, practices that would have been unthinkable before became routine. Families would pre-dig graves for family members who were still healthy. Children would be taught to recognize the early signs of plague so they could abandon infected relatives quickly enough to save themselves. Marriage ceremonies included provisions for what would happen when one spouse died, which everyone assumed would be soon. The economic disruption was just as severe as the social upheaval, but in ways that revealed dark truths about medieval society. When huge portions of the population died, you might expect that the survivors would inherit wealth and property, creating a more equal society. That's not what happened. Instead, the surviving elite used the chaos to consolidate even more power and wealth. They bought up abandoned lands for almost nothing, absorbed the assets of extinct families, and restructured society to benefit themselves. Meanwhile, surviving peasants and workers, who should have had more bargaining power due to labor shortages, found themselves facing even harsher restrictions. Laws were passed freezing wages at pre-plague levels. Workers who demanded better conditions were accused of taking advantage of Christian tragedy for personal gain. The surviving nobility essentially used the plague as an excuse to create an even more oppressive system than had existed before. This pattern reveals something deeply disturbing about how societies respond to existential crises. Rather than coming together and building something better from the ashes, people often use disasters as opportunities to settle old scores and grab power. The Black Death didn't create a more just society, it created a more paranoid, violent, and divided one. And we haven't even talked about the scapegoating yet. When people are desperate for someone to blame for an inexplicable catastrophe, they'll find targets. The Black Death unleashed some of the most horrific persecution in European history, and the victims were often the most vulnerable members of society. But that's a story so dark and complex that it deserves its own dedicated exploration. What I want you to understand as we close this first part is that the Black Death wasn't just a medical crisis or even a social crisis. It was a complete psychological breakdown of medieval civilization. Everything people thought they knew about how the world worked, about justice, about divine protection, about social order, and away all pretense and showed humanity exactly what it was capable, was revealed to be an illusion. The plague strip of when pushed to the absolute limit. The secrets I've shared tonight are just the beginning. In the next part of this series, we're going to dive even deeper into the darkness. We'll explore the persecution and violence that the plague unleashed, the bizarre religious movements that emerged from the chaos, and the long-term psychological scars that shaped European culture for centuries to come. Trust me, what you've heard tonight is disturbing, but it's nothing compared to what's coming next. The scapegoating I mentioned at the end of the last section wasn't just cruel, it was systematic. And it reveals one of the darkest secrets about how humans respond when their world collapses. When the Black Death struck, people didn't just need someone to blame, they needed someone to punish. They needed to feel like they had some control over the uncontrollable. What happened next was a cascade of violence so brutal that even medieval chroniclers, who were used to describing warfare and executions, struggled to find words for it. Let's start with the most obvious targets. Jewish communities across Europe became the focus of a conspiracy theory so insane it defies logic, yet it spread faster than the plague itself. People genuinely believed that Jewish people were poisoning wells, rivers, and food supplies to deliberately spread the disease. Think about how ridiculous this is for a moment. Why would any group poison water sources that they themselves used? Why would they want to spread a disease that was killing them just as brutally as everyone else? But logic had nothing to do with it. Fear had completely overridden rational thought. In city after city, mobs would form and march toward Jewish quarters. What happened next wasn't just violence, it was organized extermination. In Strasbourg alone, over 2,000 Jewish people were burned alive in a single day. The chronicler who recorded this event wrote that the screams could be heard from 3 miles away and that the smoke hung over the city for weeks. Here's what makes this even more horrifying. These weren't spontaneous outbursts of mob violence. They were often planned and coordinated by local authorities who saw an opportunity to solve their financial problems. Many cities owed substantial debts to Jewish moneylenders. When the plague arrived, it became convenient to eliminate both the creditors and the debt simultaneously. Kill the Jewish population, seize their property, and declare the loans void. It was genocide with a profit motive. The techniques used were deliberately designed to maximize suffering. In some cities, Jewish families were locked inside synagogues which were then set on fire. In others, they were forced to dig their own mass graves before being pushed in alive. Children were sometimes spared death but forcibly converted to Christianity and distributed among Christian families as servants or slaves. The psychological torture was as systematic as the physical violence, but here's a secret that's even darker. Many of the people participating in these massacres were themselves dying of plague. There are accounts of plague victims, covered in buboes and clearly near death, dragging themselves from their sickbeds to join in the violence. They seemed to believe that murdering innocent people would somehow save them from their own inevitable death. It was magical thinking taken to its most evil extreme. And it wasn't just Jewish communities. Anyone who seemed different or vulnerable became a target. Lepers were accused of spreading poison. Foreign merchants were attacked as agents of distant enemies. Even people with unusual physical features like birthmarks or scars were sometimes accused of being marked by the devil and killed by their neighbors. One particularly disturbing case comes from a small town in Germany, where a woman with a cleft lip was accused of cursing the local well. The evidence against her. She had been seen drawing water from the well the day before the first plague death occurred. That was it. No poison was found. No other evidence existed. But the entire town became convinced that her physical deformity was proof of supernatural malice. She was tortured until she confessed a crime she obviously didn't commit, then burned alive while her own children were forced to watch. This pattern of scapegoating reveals something terrifying about human psychology. When faced with a threat they can't understand or control, people will create elaborate explanations that give them someone to blame, even if those explanations make no sense. The alternative, accepting that bad things sometimes happen for no reason and that we're all vulnerable to forces beyond our control, is apparently more frightening than committing murder. But the violence wasn't limited to scapegoating outsiders. The plague also turned communities against themselves in ways that were equally brutal. Families would abandon sick members, not just to avoid infection, but because caring for plague victims required resources that healthy family members wanted to preserve for themselves. There are documented cases of parents throwing their own children out of houses when they showed early symptoms of plague, literally leaving them to die in the streets. The economic pressures created by the plague made these family betrayals even more common. When food became scarce and expensive, households had to make terrible calculations about who was worth feeding. The old, the sick, and the very young were often sacrificed to preserve the lives of working-age adults. Elderly parents would be abandoned by their children. Infants would be left at church doors or simply exposed to the elements. Disabled family members were seen as burdens that families could no longer afford. These weren't decisions made by evil people. They were choices made by ordinary families pushed beyond their breaking point. That's what makes them so disturbing. When you read the surviving letters and diary entries from this period, you can see people struggling with these impossible moral choices. They knew what they were doing was wrong, but they felt like they had no alternatives. Survival had become more important than humanity. The plague also created opportunities for existing tensions and grudges to explode into violence. Neighbors who had feuded over property lines or business disputes suddenly had an excuse to eliminate their enemies. They could accuse rivals of spreading plague, of being in league with supernatural forces, or simply take advantage of the chaos to commit murder and theft. Local authorities were often too overwhelmed or too dead to investigate crimes properly, so violence became a way to settle scores with impunity. One chronicle from France describes a merchant who used the plague as cover to eliminate his business competitors. He would start rumors that competing merchants were spreading disease through their goods, then organize boycotts and sometimes violent attacks on their shops. By the time the plague had passed, he had effectively destroyed 5 rival businesses and absorbed their customer base. When questioned about his tactics years later, he reportedly said that the plague had taught him that only the ruthless survive. This kind of opportunistic violence was everywhere. Landlords would evict plague survivors from valuable properties, claiming the buildings needed to be purified. Employers would refuse to pay wages to families of dead workers, arguing that the deceased had broken their contracts by dying. Inheritance disputes that might normally take years to resolve in courts were settled through intimidation and sometimes murder. The breakdown of legal systems created a kind of anarchic environment where might made right. When judges, lawyers, and law enforcement officers were dying at the same rate as everyone else, there was no one left to maintain order or protect the vulnerable. This led to the rise of what can only be described as plague warlords, individuals who gathered followers and used violence to control territory and resources. These weren't necessarily evil people, at least not at first. Many started as community leaders trying to organize survival efforts, but the combination of desperate circumstances and unchecked power corrupted them quickly. They would begin by organizing food distribution and security patrols, then gradually start demanding tribute from the people they protected. Eventually, some became indistinguishable from bandits, using the threat of abandonment to the plague as leverage to extract wealth and obedience. The most successful of these plague warlords understood that fear was more powerful than force. They would cultivate reputations for supernatural knowledge or divine favor, claiming they could predict who would get sick or that they had special protection from God. People were so desperate for any sense of security that they would submit to almost any authority figure who promised safety, even when that promise was obviously false. One of the most chilling examples comes from a region in northern Italy where a former monk named Brother Matteo claimed that God had given him the power to protect people from plague through prayer and penance. He gathered hundreds of followers who believed his promises of divine protection. In reality, he was using his position to accumulate wealth and control. When plague inevitably struck his community, he blamed their lack of faith and demanded even more extreme forms of penance, including self-flagellation and the sacrifice of personal property. When people started dying despite following his instructions, instead of admitting he was a fraud, Brother Matteo claimed that the deaths were punishment for hidden sins. He began conducting purification rituals that were basically torture sessions, forcing his followers to confess to increasingly elaborate crimes against God. The community became a nightmare of paranoia and violence, with people accusing each other of secret sins to avoid being selected for purification themselves. This pattern of religious hysteria was repeated across Europe, but it took different forms depending on local conditions and personalities. In some places, it manifested as extreme asceticism, with people believing that physical suffering would appease God's anger. In others, it became hedonistic, with people deciding that since they were all doomed anyway, they might as well indulge every desire before death claimed them. The flagellant movement represents perhaps the most visible example of plague-induced religious mania. These were groups of people who would travel from town to town, publicly whipping themselves until they bled, believing that their suffering would convince God to end the plague. But what started as genuine religious devotion quickly became something much darker. Flagellant processions became opportunities for mass hysteria and violence. The participants would work themselves into frenzied states where rational thought became impossible. In this condition, they were easily manipulated by leaders who used their religious fervor to target enemies. Jewish communities were frequent victims, but so were accused heretics, rival religious leaders, and anyone who questioned the flagellant's methods. The spectacle of these processions was deliberately designed to be as disturbing as possible. Participants would strip to the waist and beat themselves with whips embedded with metal spikes until their backs were shredded and bloody. They would chant prayers and hymns while marching through towns, leaving trails of blood in the streets. The psychological impact on observers was intense, creating an atmosphere of hysteria that made people susceptible to whatever message the flagellant leaders wanted to spread. But here's what makes the flagellant movement particularly sinister. Many of its leaders weren't motivated by religious conviction at all. They were opportunists who recognized that people in extreme psychological distress could be controlled and exploited. They would use the movement to enrich themselves, settling in towns and demanding food, shelter, and money in exchange for their supposed spiritual services. Some flagellant leaders also used their influence for political purposes, allying themselves with local nobles or merchants who wanted to use religious hysteria to advance their own interests. The movement became a weapon for social control, a way to channel people's desperation and fear into actions that benefited the powerful while providing an outlet for the masses' need to feel like they were doing. Flagellant movement was how it normalized something meaningful. The most disturbing aspect of third extreme violence as a form of religious expression. Communities that hosted flagellant processions often experienced spikes in other forms of violence afterward. People who had watched the ritualized self-harm began to see all forms of brutality as potentially sacred. This led to an escalation in the persecution of scapegoats and an increase in domestic violence and child abuse. The psychological damage caused by these movements lasted long after the plague itself had passed. Entire generations grew up believing that extreme suffering was not just acceptable, but necessary for spiritual salvation. This created a culture of violence and self-harm that influenced European society for centuries. The idea that pain and brutality could be holy became deeply embedded in religious practice and social customs. What we're seeing in all of these examples is how a medical crisis became a complete moral collapse. The plague didn't just kill bodies, it killed the social bonds and ethical frameworks that held communities together. People didn't just lose their lives, they lost their humanity. And perhaps most disturbing of all, many of them seemed to embrace that loss, finding relief in abandoning the moral constraints that had previously governed their behavior. The secrets I've shared with you tonight reveal something terrifying about human nature. When pushed to our absolute limits, when faced with circumstances that exceed our ability to cope, we don't necessarily become heroes. We often become monsters. The plague didn't bring out the best in people. It revealed depths of cruelty and selfishness that most preferred to pretend didn't exist. But we're still not done exploring these dark waters. In our next section, we're going to examine how the plague changed European culture permanently, creating new forms of art, literature, and philosophy that were obsessed with death and suffering. We'll also look at how the trauma of the Black Death influenced political systems, economic structures, and social hierarchies for generations to come. The plague may have ended, but its psychological legacy shaped the world we live in today in ways you've probably never imagined. The trauma of surviving the Black Death created something unprecedented in human history, an entire civilization obsessed with death. But not death as a natural end to life, death as entertainment, as art, as a way of understanding reality itself. The survivors didn't just move on and rebuild. They created a culture so fundamentally altered by their experience that it became unrecognizable from what came before. Let's talk about the art that emerged from this psychological wasteland. You've probably seen medieval paintings of skeletons dancing with kings and peasants, images that seem quaint or even humorous to modern eyes. But these weren't cute allegories about mortality. They were literal representations of how plague survivors saw the world. Death wasn't a distant future event, it was a constant presence, a party guest who never left. The dance of death paintings that appeared across Europe weren't just artistic expressions, they were psychological documents. Artists who had watched their families, friends, and entire communities die, created these images as a way to process trauma that had no name and no cure. They painted death as a seductive figure, sometimes beautiful, sometimes terrifying, but always intimately connected to daily life. What's particularly disturbing about these artworks is how they romanticize suffering. In many paintings from this period, plague victims are depicted with expressions of ecstasy, as if dying horribly was a transcendent experience. This wasn't artistic license. It reflected a genuine psychological phenomenon among survivors. Many plague witnesses reported that they had seen dying people appear to be in states of bliss, speaking to invisible figures or laughing as their bodies shut down. Modern psychologists would probably recognize these as symptoms of delirium or shock, but medieval survivors interpreted them as evidence that death was actually a release from earthly suffering. This belief became so widespread that some communities began to view plague death as preferable to natural death. There are records of people deliberately exposing themselves to infection, believing that dying from plague would guarantee them a place in heaven. This death obsession extended far beyond art into daily life in ways that would seem insane to us today. Survivors began incorporating death imagery into everything: clothing, jewelry, furniture, even children's toys. Wealthy families would commission portraits of themselves as skeletons or decomposing corpses. Wedding ceremonies included detailed discussions of what would happen when the bride and groom died, which everyone assumed would be soon. The most extreme example of this cultural shift was the emergence of what historians call death guilds. These were social organizations built entirely around preparing for and celebrating death. Members would meet regularly to discuss their own mortality, plan elaborate funeral ceremonies, and practice dying through meditation and ritual. Some guilds required members to sleep in coffins once a week, or spend entire days in cemeteries as a form of spiritual exercise. But the psychological changes went deeper than morbid fascination. The plague had shattered people's faith in the future itself. Why plan for tomorrow when tomorrow might not come? Why save money when you might be dead before you can spend it? Why follow rules when the rule makers were all dying? This created what we might now call a permanent crisis mindset that fundamentally altered how European society operated. Instead of long-term planning and gradual development, everything became focused on immediate gratification and short-term survival. This had profound economic consequences that lasted for generations. Before the plague, medieval society was built on complex networks of obligation and expectation that extended far into the future. Craftsmen would spend decades learning their trades, knowing they would practice them for life and pass them to their children. Farmers would plant crops expecting to harvest them. Merchants would invest in goods expecting to sell them. Nobles would make plans expecting to execute them over years or decades. The plague destroyed all of that. Surviving craftsmen found themselves in a world where their skills might be useless tomorrow if another outbreak occurred. Farmers stopped investing in long-term soil improvement because they might not live to see the benefits. Merchants began dealing only in goods that could be sold immediately. The entire economic system shifted from long-term stability to short-term opportunism. This created a boom in certain types of businesses while destroying others completely. Industries focused on immediate pleasure and consumption flourished. Taverns, brothels, and gambling houses multiplied rapidly as people spent their money on instant gratification rather than saving for a future they didn't believe would exist. Meanwhile, industries that required long-term investment, like education, infrastructure development, and technological innovation, nearly collapsed. The psychological impact on children was particularly severe. An entire generation grew up believing that death was random, inevitable, and imminent. These children developed coping mechanisms that seemed adaptive in a plague environment but were deeply dysfunctional in normal circumstances. They became hypervigilant about signs of illness, obsessively focused on physical symptoms, and unable to form deep emotional attachments because they expected everyone they loved to die. Many plague-era children also developed what we might now recognize as severe anxiety disorders. But medieval society interpreted these symptoms as spiritual gifts. Children who had panic attacks were thought to be receiving visions from God. Those who developed obsessive-compulsive behaviors around cleanliness or ritual were seen as particularly devout. Instead of receiving treatment, these traumatized children were often pushed into religious life, where their symptoms were reinterpreted as signs of holiness. The educational system was completely disrupted, not just because teachers died, but because the entire concept of education became questionable. Why spend years learning to read and write when you might die before you could use those skills? Why study philosophy or mathematics when the only knowledge that mattered was how to recognize plague symptoms and prepare for death? Many schools and universities closed permanently, not just from lack of students and teachers, but because communities decided that education was a luxury they could no longer afford. The few that survived shifted their focus dramatically, emphasizing practical skills for immediate survival, rather than abstract learning for long-term development. This educational disruption had cascading effects that lasted for centuries. The loss of institutional knowledge meant that many technological and scientific advances were forgotten. Medical knowledge, ironically, actually regressed in some areas because the most experienced physicians had died and their apprentices had never completed their training. Agricultural techniques that had taken generations to develop were lost when experienced farmers died before they could pass on their knowledge. The plague also fundamentally altered how people thought about authority and social hierarchy. Before the Black Death, medieval society was built on the assumption that social position reflected divine will. Kings ruled because God had chosen them, nobles were wealthy because they deserved to be, and peasants were poor because that was their rightful place in the cosmic order. But the plague was completely egalitarian in its destruction. Kings died just as horribly as beggars, bishops succumbed just as quickly as heretics, and wealthy merchants suffered just as much as landless peasants. This created a crisis of legitimacy that undermined every traditional source of authority. Survivors began asking uncomfortable questions that had been unthinkable before. If God protected the righteous, why did pious people die while sinners survived? If noble blood was superior, why didn't it provide any protection against disease? If wealth could buy anything, why couldn't it buy safety from plague? These questions led to the development of new philosophical and religious ideas that were fundamentally different from medieval orthodoxy. Some survivors concluded that God was either powerless or indifferent to human suffering. Others decided that traditional morality was meaningless if good and evil people suffered equally. Still others embraced a kind of fatalism that made human choice and responsibility irrelevant. The most radical of these new belief systems rejected the entire concept of divine justice. If the plague proved anything, they argued, it was that the universe was fundamentally random and cruel. This led to the emergence of philosophical movements that were essentially nihilistic, viewing life as meaningless suffering that could only be endured, never overcome. But perhaps more disturbing were the religious movements that embraced the plague as a positive force. These groups concluded that since God had sent the plague, it must be good, even if humans couldn't understand why. They developed theologies that celebrated suffering, viewed death as liberation, and interpreted survival as a form of divine punishment. Some of these plague cults became extremely dangerous, actively working to spread disease because they believed it was God's will. They would deliberately infect themselves and others, viewing this as a form of religious service. They saw people who tried to avoid plague as rebels against divine authority, who deserved to be punished. The social changes were just as dramatic as the religious and philosophical ones. The plague had killed so many people that traditional social structures simply couldn't function anymore. In many areas, entire social classes had been wiped out. Noble families that had ruled for generations were extinct. Guild systems that had taken centuries to develop collapsed when all the skilled craftsmen died. This created opportunities for dramatic social mobility, but not in the way you might expect. Instead of creating a more egalitarian society, the plague often led to even greater concentration of power and wealth. The survivors who were ruthless enough to take advantage of the chaos could accumulate resources on a scale that had been impossible before. Some plague survivors became incredibly wealthy simply by outliving everyone else. They inherited property from multiple family lines, absorbed the assets of extinct businesses, and bought valuable land for almost nothing from desperate sellers. But this wealth came with a psychological cost. Many of these plague millionaires developed severe guilt and paranoia, convinced that their success was somehow connected to their neighbors' deaths. The marriage and family systems were also completely transformed. When so many people had died, traditional marriage patterns became impossible to maintain. There weren't enough eligible partners within appropriate social classes, so people began marrying across class lines in ways that would have been scandalous before the plague. But these marriages were often purely practical arrangements focused on survival rather than emotional connection. Couples would marry not for love or even political alliance, but simply to pool resources and increase their chances of surviving another outbreak. Many marriage contracts from this period read more like business partnerships than romantic commitments. The treatment of children changed dramatically as well. Before the plague, children had been viewed as investments in the future, carefully raised and educated to carry on family traditions and occupations. After the plague, children were often seen as temporary additions to the household who might die at any moment. This led to a strange paradox in child-rearing practices. On one hand, parents became overprotective, obsessively monitoring their children for signs of illness and restricting their activities to minimize infection risk. On the other hand, many parents became emotionally distant, refusing to form deep attachments to children they expected to lose. The psychological impact on children who grew up in this environment was devastating. Many developed attachment disorders, unable to form close relationships because they had learned that everyone they loved would eventually abandon them through death. Others became hypervigilant and anxious, constantly scanning their environment for threats that might never come. These trauma responses were passed down through generations, creating family patterns of emotional dysfunction that lasted long after the plague itself had ended. Parents who had survived the plague often raised their children with the same crisis mentality that had helped them survive, even when that mentality was no longer necessary or helpful. The legal system had to be completely reconstructed because so many judges, lawyers, and legal scholars had died. But the new legal frameworks that emerged were fundamentally different from what had existed before. Pre-plague law had been based on the assumption that society was stable and that legal precedents established over generations should be respected. Post-plague law was much more focused on immediate practical problems and emergency situations. New laws were created to deal with issues that had never existed before. What to do with property when entire family lines had been extinguished. How to handle inheritance when normal succession was impossible. How to maintain order when traditional authority figures were dead. Many of these emergency legal measures became permanent features of European legal systems, creating a more centralized and authoritarian approach to governance that persisted long after the crisis had passed. The plague had taught survivors that individual rights and traditional freedoms were luxuries that could be suspended when survival was at stake. The long-term political consequences were enormous. The plague had demonstrated that traditional feudal relationships couldn't provide protection against existential threats, which led to the gradual development of more centralized nation-states with stronger governmental authority. Kings and princes began claiming powers that would have been unthinkable before the plague, justifying these expansions of authority as necessary for public health and safety. But perhaps the most lasting change was psychological. The generation that survived the Black Death never fully recovered from the trauma, and they passed that damage on to their children and grandchildren. European culture became permanently marked by anxiety, paranoia, and obsession with death that influenced art, literature, philosophy, and politics for centuries. This trauma response shaped everything from architectural styles to military tactics to religious practices. Buildings became more fortress-like, designed to protect against siege and isolation. Military strategies focused more on defense and survival than conquest and expansion. Religious practices emphasized preparation for death and judgment rather than celebration of life and community. The survivors had learned that the world was fundamentally dangerous and unpredictable, that death could come at any moment, and that traditional sources of safety and meaning were illusions. This worldview became embedded in European culture so deeply that its influence can still be traced today in everything from insurance practices to medical protocols to emergency planning procedures. We're still living with the psychological legacy of the Black Death, still shaped by trauma responses that developed 7 centuries ago. The plague didn't just kill a third of Europe's population, it fundamentally altered how Western civilization thinks about risk, safety, mortality, and meaning. And there's still more to uncover about how this medieval nightmare shaped the world we inhabit today. The Reconstruction period after the Black Death revealed something even more sinister about human nature. As communities slowly began to rebuild, the choices they made weren't about creating a better world from the ashes. Instead, they systematically institutionalized the worst impulses that had emerged during the crisis. The temporary brutalities became permanent features of European society. Let's examine how the plague transformed the concept of medicine itself. Before the Black Death, healing was often seen as a collaborative process between patient, family, and healer. Communities would come together to care for the sick, sharing knowledge and resources. But the plague changed all of that forever. The medical profession that emerged from the ashes was fundamentally different. It was secretive, hierarchical, and deliberately intimidating. The famous plague doctor costume wasn't just protective gear, it was psychological armor designed to create distance between healer and patient. The long beak, the dark robes, the wide-brimmed hat, all of it served to dehumanize the medical encounter. This wasn't accidental. Surviving medical texts from the post-plague period reveal a deliberate strategy to make medicine mysterious and frightening. Physicians had learned during the plague that their actual medical knowledge was worthless, but they discovered that theatrical presentation could be incredibly powerful. If they couldn't cure diseases, they could at least control the narrative around illness and death. The emergence of medical Latin as the exclusive language of healing was part of this strategy. Before the plague, many healers used local languages and involved families in treatment decisions. After the plague, medicine became deliberately incomprehensible to ordinary people. Physicians would speak in Latin phrases that patients couldn't understand, prescribe treatments with exotic names, and create elaborate rituals around the simplest procedures. This medical mystification served multiple purposes. It protected physicians from blame when treatments failed. It justified charging higher fees for what was essentially theatre. And it gave survivors a sense that someone, somewhere, understood the forces that had devastated their world. Even if the understanding was fake, the illusion of expertise was psychologically necessary. The treatments themselves became more elaborate and expensive, not because they were more effective, but because complexity suggested sophistication. Simple folk remedies that might actually have provided some comfort were abandoned in favor of complicated procedures involving rare ingredients and specialized tools. The more painful and expensive a treatment was, the more likely people were to believe it might work. This medical theatre reached its peak with the development of what we might call luxury suffering. Wealthy families would pay enormous sums for medical procedures that were essentially torture, believing that the cost and pain proved the treatment's value. Bloodletting became an elaborate ritual involving silver instruments and ceremonial bowls. Purging was elevated to an art form with specially prepared concoctions that cost more than most people earned in a year. But the real horror was how this medical mystification spread beyond physical healing into psychological control. Physicians began diagnosing spiritual ailments alongside physical ones, claiming authority over souls as well as bodies. They would declare that certain patients were suffering from moral corruption that required not just medical treatment, but social punishment. This medicalization of morality created new categories of human behavior that were defined as diseases requiring cure. Grief that lasted too long became melancholia requiring bloodletting. Anger at social injustice became choler needing purging. Even excessive happiness was sometimes diagnosed as a dangerous imbalance requiring correction. The implications were terrifying. Physicians could now declare that political dissent was a medical condition, that religious doubt was a symptom of disease, that any behavior they disapproved of was pathological. This gave medical authority unprecedented power to enforce social conformity through the threat of painful treatment. Women were particularly vulnerable to this medicalized social control. Behaviors that had been considered normal before the plague, like assertiveness, independence, or sexual desire, were reclassified as symptoms of hysteria or possession requiring aggressive intervention. Treatments for female disorders often involved procedures that were indistinguishable from torture, justified as necessary medicine. The plague had also created a new relationship between medicine and death that was fundamentally corrupt. Instead of fighting death, physicians learned to profit from it. They developed elaborate prognostic rituals that were really just ways of extracting money from desperate families while providing entertainment value for the physician. These death predictions became spectacles that combined medical authority with supernatural drama. Physicians would examine patients through elaborate procedures involving astrology, urine analysis, and interpretation of bodily signs, then deliver pronouncements about when and how death would occur. Families would pay premium prices for these performances, even though everyone knew the predictions were essentially random. What made this particularly sinister was how physicians learned to manipulate the timing of their predictions for maximum profit. They would tell wealthy families that death was imminent but could possibly be delayed through expensive treatments, then gradually extend the timeline as long as payments continued. Poor families would be told that death was certain and immediate, effectively ending their access to any medical care. The economic model that emerged from this corruption was sustainable precisely because it didn't depend on actually healing anyone. Physicians could maintain profitable practices by managing expectations and controlling information, regardless of patient outcomes. Success was measured not by recovery rates, but by how much families were willing to pay for the illusion of medical intervention. This corruption spread throughout the entire healthcare system. Apothecaries learned to create expensive medicines from cheap ingredients, knowing that patients couldn't distinguish between effective and ineffective treatments. Surgeons developed procedures that were designed more for visual impact than therapeutic benefit, understanding that families wanted to see dramatic interventions even if they didn't help. The most disturbing aspect of this medical corruption was how it created incentives for physicians to keep patients sick rather than heal them. A healthy patient was a former customer, but a chronically ill patient was a steady source of income. Treatments were designed to provide temporary relief, followed by recurring symptoms that required ongoing intervention. This led to the development of what we might call addiction medicine, where physicians would prescribe treatments that created dependency on continued medical care. Opium-based medicines were particularly useful for this purpose, providing genuine pain relief while creating physical dependence that ensured patients would return for more. The psychological manipulation involved in this system was sophisticated and cruel. Physicians learned to alternate hope and despair, providing just enough improvement to keep families paying, while ensuring that complete recovery remained elusive. They became experts at reading family dynamics and exploiting emotional vulnerabilities for financial gain. But the corruption extended beyond individual medical practice into the entire structure of how society understood health and illness. The plague had taught people that disease was random and uncontrollable, which created market conditions perfect for medical fraud. When people believe that illness is essentially mysterious, they become willing to pay for any treatment that offers hope, regardless of evidence or logic. This created a medical marketplace, where the most successful practitioners were often the most dishonest ones. Honest physicians who admitted the limits of their knowledge couldn't compete with charlatans who promised miraculous cures. The economic incentives systematically selected for deception over competence. The long-term consequences of this medical corruption were devastating. It created a healthcare system that was fundamentally predatory, designed to extract resources from vulnerable people rather than promote healing. This model became so embedded in European medical culture that its influence persisted for centuries, shaping how Western medicine approached the relationship between healer and patient. Even more disturbing was how this corruption normalized the idea that suffering was profitable. The medical system that emerged from the plague operated on the principle that human misery could be monetized, that pain and fear were valuable commodities to be bought and sold. This created a cultural acceptance of exploitation that extended far beyond medicine into other areas of social life. The plague had also transformed how European society understood the relationship between individual and collective responsibility for health. Before the Black Death, communities often shared responsibility for caring for the sick and preventing disease. Public health was seen as a common concern requiring collective action. After the plague, this collective responsibility was systematically dismantled and replaced with individual accountability. People were taught that their health status reflected their personal moral worth, that illness was often a punishment for sin or failure, and that healthy people had no obligation to help the sick beyond basic charity. This individualization of health responsibility served the interests of the corrupt medical system perfectly. If illness was primarily a personal failing, then expensive individual treatments were the logical solution. If disease reflected moral weakness, then painful interventions could be justified as spiritual correction. If health was a private matter, then public investment in prevention or community care was unnecessary. The psychological impact of this shift was enormous. Sick people learned to blame themselves for their conditions, which made them more willing to accept harsh treatments and less likely to question medical authority. Healthy people learned to see illness as evidence of personal inadequacy, which reduced their empathy for the suffering and their willingness to support social programs for healthcare. This transformation of health from a collective concern to an individual responsibility became one of the most lasting legacies of the Black Death. It created social attitudes toward illness, disability, and medical care that shaped European culture for centuries and continue to influence modern healthcare systems today. The plague had taught people that they were fundamentally alone in their struggle against disease and death, that traditional sources of support and protection were unreliable, and that survival depended on individual resources rather than community cooperation. These lessons became embedded so deeply in post-plague culture that they seemed like natural truths rather than historical artifacts of a specific traumatic experience. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of this medical corruption was how it taught people to distrust their own experiences and perceptions. The elaborate medical theatre that developed after the plague was designed to convince patients that their subjective experience of illness was unreliable, that only trained experts could understand what was really happening in their bodies. This created a form of medical gaslighting that made people dependent on professional interpretation of their own physical sensations. Patients learned to doubt their own pain, to question their own symptoms, and to defer to medical authority even when that authority was obviously corrupt or incompetent. The psychological techniques used to maintain this dependence were sophisticated and cruel. Physicians would alternate between dismissing patient concerns as imaginary and diagnosing serious conditions that required immediate expensive treatment. They learned to create anxiety about symptoms that might develop, then offer preventive treatments for conditions that didn't exist. This manipulation was particularly effective because it exploited the trauma and paranoia that the plague had created in survivors. People who had learned that death could come suddenly and without warning were vulnerable to medical authorities who claimed they could detect hidden dangers and provide protection against invisible threats. The business model that emerged from this exploitation was incredibly profitable and remarkably stable. Unlike other forms of fraud that eventually collapsed when victims realized they had been cheated, medical fraud could continue indefinitely because the victims often died before they could expose the deception, and survivors could always be convinced that the treatments had prevented even worse outcomes. This created a perfect crime that was essentially self-concealing. Failed treatments could always be blamed on the patient's lack of faith, delayed compliance, or hidden moral failings. Successful recoveries could be credited to the physician's skill, even when they occurred despite rather than because of medical intervention. The system was designed to make medical authority unfalsifiable and therefore unassailable. The cultural impact of this medical corruption extended far beyond healthcare into the entire structure of how post-plague European society understood expertise and authority. The model of mysterious, expensive, theatrical intervention became the template for how professional classes in other fields claimed and maintained social power. Legal systems became more complex and incomprehensible, requiring expensive professional interpretation of situations that ordinary people had previously handled themselves. Religious practices became more elaborate and hierarchical, with clergy claiming exclusive access to divine knowledge that had once been considered available to all believers. Educational systems became more exclusive and expensive, creating artificial barriers between expert knowledge and common understanding. In each case, the pattern was the same. Professional classes used complexity, mystery, and theatrical presentation to create dependence on their services, then use that dependence to extract resources and maintain social control. The medical model that had emerged from plague trauma became the blueprint for how power operated in post-medieval European society. This transformation represented something new in human history. Previous societies had certainly had inequalities and exploitation, but the post-plague European model was different because it was based on the systematic creation and manipulation of anxiety about invisible threats. People were taught to fear dangers they couldn't see or understand, then offered protection by the same authorities who had created the fear. This anxiety-based social control was incredibly effective because it was self-reinforcing. The more afraid people became, the more willing they were to pay for protection. The more they paid, the more invested they became in believing that the protection was necessary. The more they believed in invisible threats, the more afraid they became. It was a perfect psychological trap that could maintain itself indefinitely. The plague had created the perfect conditions for this system to develop by demonstrating that invisible forces could indeed cause massive destruction, that traditional sources of protection were unreliable, and that survival required constant vigilance against threats that couldn't be predicted or understood through ordinary means. These lessons, learned through genuine trauma, created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by anyone clever enough to claim special knowledge about invisible dangers. And exploitation is exactly what happened, on a scale that transformed European civilization itself into something fundamentally different from what had existed before the Black Death. The trauma of the plague didn't just kill people, it killed entire ways of thinking about trust, community, knowledge, and power that had developed over centuries of human social evolution. What emerged in their place was something much darker, more paranoid, and more exploitative. The Europe that rebuilt itself after the plague was not the same civilization that had existed before. It was something new and terrible that would cast its shadow over the development of Western culture for centuries to come. The transformation of European agriculture after the Black Death reveals another layer of this civilization-wide corruption that historians have largely ignored. When massive populations died, you might expect that the survivors would inherit better farmland, more resources, and easier lives. That's not remotely what happened. Instead, the agricultural system that emerged was deliberately designed to keep survivors in a state of perpetual anxiety and dependence. Before the plague, farming communities operated on centuries-old traditions of shared knowledge and mutual support. Experienced farmers would teach younger ones, communities would work together during planting and harvest seasons, and agricultural techniques would be passed down through generations of careful observation and gradual improvement. The plague destroyed all of this overnight. But here's what's truly sinister about what happened next. The surviving landowners didn't try to rebuild the old cooperative systems. Instead, they used the agricultural crisis as an opportunity to create something far more controlling and profitable. They began hoarding agricultural knowledge, treating farming techniques as trade secrets that could be monetized, rather than community wisdom that should be shared. This created artificial scarcity in something that had always been abundant. Basic knowledge about how to grow food. Surviving farmers found themselves dependent on landlords and agricultural experts who claimed to possess special knowledge about soil management, crop rotation, and livestock care. Much of this expertise was completely fabricated, but desperate farmers had no way to distinguish between genuine knowledge and elaborate fraud. The most disturbing example of this agricultural manipulation comes from records of seed distribution in northern France. Landlords would sell farmers' seeds that they claimed were specially blessed or treated with secret preparations to resist plague-related crop diseases. These seeds were often just normal seeds sold at inflated prices, but farmers were so terrified of crop failure that they would pay enormous sums for the illusion of protection. When crops failed anyway, which they often did because of normal weather variations or soil problems, the failures were always blamed on the farmer's lack of faith in the special seeds or their failure to follow the secret planting instructions correctly. This created a perfect system of exploitation where the landlords could never be wrong and the farmers could never prove they were being cheated. The psychological manipulation involved in this agricultural fraud was sophisticated and cruel. Landlords learned to alternate between offering hope through expensive innovations and creating fear about potential crop disasters. They would spread rumors about new forms of plant disease, then offer costly preventive treatments. They would claim that traditional farming methods were now dangerous because the plague had somehow changed the soil or the climate. This constant state of agricultural anxiety served multiple purposes. It kept farmers dependent on landlord expertise. It justified higher rents and fees for agricultural services. And it prevented farming communities from developing the kind of independence and cooperation that might challenge the new power structures. The long-term consequences were devastating for food security and agricultural development. Instead of building on centuries of accumulated farming wisdom, post-plague agriculture became increasingly superstitious and inefficient. Farmers were afraid to experiment with traditional techniques because they had been taught that deviation from expert guidance could lead to catastrophic crop failure. This agricultural anxiety also created perfect conditions for what we might call disaster capitalism. Whenever crops failed or livestock died, which was inevitable in any agricultural system, merchants and landlords would swoop in with expensive solutions that often made problems worse rather than better. They would offer emergency loans at crushing interest rates, sell inferior replacement livestock at premium prices, and provide temporary labour at wages that ensured farmers could never escape debt. The plague had also fundamentally altered how European society understood the relationship between humans and nature. Before the Black Death, farming was seen as a collaborative relationship between human skill and natural forces. Farmers worked with seasonal cycles, weather patterns, and soil conditions to produce food through careful observation and gradual adaptation. After the plague, agriculture became viewed as a constant battle against hostile natural forces that were trying to destroy human civilization. This adversarial relationship with nature justified increasingly aggressive and destructive farming practices that prioritized short-term yields over long-term sustainability. The psychological impact of this shift was enormous. Farmers who had once seen themselves as partners with natural systems began to view themselves as warriors fighting against a malevolent environment. This created a mentality of conquest, rather than cooperation, that influenced not just agriculture, but European attitudes toward nature itself for centuries to come. This adversarial approach to agriculture also provided perfect justification for the expansion of European colonization. If nature was fundamentally hostile and required aggressive human control, then taking land from indigenous peoples who used different agricultural methods could be seen as a form of environmental improvement rather than theft. The techniques that European colonizers used to justify seizing indigenous lands were directly descended from the agricultural ideologies that had developed after the plague. Native farming methods that worked sustainably with local ecosystems were dismissed as primitive or inefficient because they didn't conform to the European model of aggressive environmental control. This agricultural colonization was often more devastating than military conquest because it destroyed the ecological foundations that indigenous communities depended on for survival. European farming techniques that had been designed for different climates and soil conditions would be imposed on landscapes where they caused environmental degradation and crop failure. But the corruption of post-plague agriculture extended beyond just farming techniques into the entire economic system that surrounded food production. The plague had created shortages that made food incredibly valuable, which attracted opportunistic merchants who saw agriculture as a way to extract wealth rather than sustain communities. These agricultural speculators developed sophisticated methods for manipulating food markets that created artificial scarcities and inflated prices. They would buy up grain stores during harvest seasons when prices were low, then release them slowly during the winter months when desperate communities would pay premium prices for basic sustenance. This market manipulation was particularly cruel because it turned food, the most basic human necessity, into a weapon for extracting wealth from vulnerable people. Communities that had once been self-sufficient found themselves dependent on distant merchants who could control their survival by manipulating supply and demand. The psychological impact of this food insecurity was devastating. People who had survived the plague learned that they couldn't depend on local food production to sustain them, which created a permanent state of anxiety about starvation that influenced their behavior for generations. This food anxiety became embedded in post-plague culture so deeply that it influenced everything from family planning to political systems. People became reluctant to have children because they weren't sure they could feed them. Communities became suspicious of outsiders who might compete for scarce food resources. Political systems became more authoritarian as leaders claimed they needed emergency powers to ensure food distribution during crises. The agricultural system that emerged from this manipulation was fundamentally different from what had existed before the plague. Instead of being based on community cooperation and environmental sustainability, it was based on individual competition and short-term profit extraction. This created a model of agriculture that was inherently unstable and environmentally destructive, but incredibly profitable for the people who controlled it. This agricultural model became the template for how European civilization approached natural resource extraction in general. The same principles of aggressive control, short-term profit maximization, and environmental exploitation that had been developed in post-plague farming were applied to forestry, mining, fishing, and eventually industrial production. The plague had taught Europeans that nature was fundamentally hostile and unpredictable, that survival required constant vigilance against natural disasters, and that traditional methods of working with natural systems were unreliable. These lessons created a civilization that was fundamentally at war with the natural world, viewing environmental destruction as a necessary price for human security. This adversarial relationship with nature became so embedded in European culture that it seemed like a natural and inevitable way of thinking rather than a specific historical response to plague trauma. The idea that humans should dominate and control natural systems, rather than cooperate with them, became a foundational assumption of Western civilization that influenced everything from scientific methodology to political philosophy. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this agricultural corruption was how it created a model for turning basic human needs into sources of profit and control. The techniques that had been developed to exploit farmers' anxiety about food production became templates for creating artificial scarcities and dependencies in other areas of human life. The same psychological manipulation that convinced farmers they needed expensive expert guidance to grow food was applied to convince people they needed professional services for activities they had previously handled themselves. Child rearing, which had once been a community activity supported by extended families and neighbours, became medicalised and professionalised. Spiritual guidance, which had once been available through community religious practices, became the exclusive domain of trained clergy who charged fees for their services. In each case, the pattern was the same. Activities that had once been cooperative community endeavours were transformed into individual problems requiring expensive professional solutions. People were taught to distrust their own capabilities and to depend on expert guidance for basic life activities that humans had successfully performed for thousands of years without professional intervention. This professionalization of basic human activities created what we might call a learned helplessness that made people dependent on complex systems of expert authority rather than their own knowledge and community relationships. The plague had taught people that their traditional ways of doing things were unreliable, which created psychological vulnerability that could be exploited by anyone claiming to offer superior alternatives. The economic model that emerged from this exploitation was incredibly profitable because it turned people's basic life activities into sources of ongoing revenue. Instead of learning skills once and using them throughout their lives, people were taught that they needed constant professional guidance and expensive interventions to handle normal life challenges. This created a form of economic servitude that was more subtle but potentially more controlling than traditional systems of social hierarchy. Instead of being directly controlled by lords or kings, people became indirectly controlled through their dependence on professional services and expert knowledge that they had been taught they couldn't live without. The psychological techniques used to maintain this dependence were sophisticated and cruel. People were taught to fear the consequences of making mistakes in areas where they had previously been confident and self-reliant. They were convinced that the stakes of normal life decisions had become so high that professional guidance was essential for survival. This fear-based social control was incredibly effective because it was internalized rather than imposed from outside. People genuinely believed that they needed professional help for activities they had once handled independently, which made them willing participants in their own exploitation rather than unwilling victims of external oppression. The cultural impact of this transformation was enormous. European society became increasingly hierarchical and specialized, with complex networks of professional authorities controlling different aspects of human life. This created a civilization that was incredibly sophisticated in some ways, but also incredibly fragile because people had lost the ability to take care of themselves and their communities without expert intervention. This professional dependence also made European society uniquely vulnerable to manipulation and control by anyone who could claim authority over essential professional services. Political systems became more centralized as rulers learned that they could control populations by controlling access to professional expertise, rather than through direct military force. The plague had created the perfect conditions for this transformation by simultaneously destroying traditional community support systems and creating anxiety about survival that made people desperate for any source of security and guidance. The civilization that emerged from this trauma was fundamentally different from what had existed before, shaped by psychological vulnerabilities that could be systematically exploited by anyone clever enough to understand how fear and dependence could be monetized. This transformation represents one of the most significant but least understood consequences of the Black Death. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed entire ways of thinking about human capability, community cooperation, and self-reliance that had been fundamental to European civilization for centuries. What emerged in their place was something much more controlled, hierarchical, and exploitative that would shape the development of Western society for generations to come. The secrets of how this transformation occurred have been buried in academic archives for centuries, dismissed as natural evolution rather than recognized as the systematic exploitation of trauma that it actually was. But understanding this hidden history is crucial for recognizing similar patterns in our own time, when crises are still being used to justify the expansion of professional authority and the erosion of individual and community self-reliance. The legacy of the Black Death continues to influence how Western civilization responds to emergencies, organizes professional expertise, and structures the relationship between individual capability and institutional authority. We're still living with social systems that were originally designed to exploit the psychological vulnerabilities created by medieval plague trauma, even though most people have no idea where these systems came from or why they developed in the first place. The corruption we've been exploring reached its most sinister form in the transformation of religious life after the Black Death. What emerged wasn't just a change in spiritual practice, it was the systematic weaponization of faith itself. The church that rebuilt from the plague's ashes wasn't focused on salvation or comfort. It was designed to extract maximum psychological and financial value from traumatized populations who had lost everything else to believe in. Before the plague, medieval Christianity had been deeply integrated into daily community life. Local priests knew their parishioners personally, religious practices were often communal celebrations, and spiritual guidance was typically gentle and supportive. The Black Death obliterated this intimate religious culture and replaced it with something far more sinister and controlling. The new religious authorities who emerged understood that plague survivors were psychologically vulnerable in unprecedented ways. These people had watched their families die horribly while their prayers went unanswered. They had seen pious believers suffer just as much as notorious sinners. Their faith had been shattered, but their need for meaning and hope remained desperately strong. Clever religious entrepreneurs recognized this psychological landscape as a goldmine of opportunity. They developed new forms of Christianity that were specifically designed to exploit plague trauma rather than heal it. Instead of offering comfort and community, they offered expensive spiritual services that promised protection from future disasters. The most profitable of these innovations was the commercialization of fear about the afterlife. Before the plague, most people had a relatively relaxed attitude toward death and judgment, trusting that a basically decent life would lead to reasonable treatment in the next world. Post-plague Christianity systematically destroyed this confidence and replaced it with terror about eternal punishment that could only be avoided through constant payment for religious services. Preachers would deliver sermons that were essentially psychological torture sessions, describing the torments of hell in graphic detail, while emphasizing how easy it was to accidentally damn yourself through minor spiritual infractions. They would tell congregations that the plague had been God's warning about how much divine anger was building up, and that even worse punishments were coming for anyone who wasn't constantly purchasing spiritual protection. These fear campaigns were incredibly effective because they exploited the genuine trauma that plague survivors had experienced. People who had watched their loved ones die in agony were all too ready to believe that even worse suffering was possible in the afterlife. The physical horrors they had witnessed became proof that spiritual horrors were equally real and imminent. The church developed elaborate systems for monetizing this spiritual terror. Indulgences, which had once been occasional fundraising tools, became a constant requirement for anyone who wanted to avoid damnation. Prices were carefully calibrated to extract maximum payment from different social classes, while keeping hope just barely alive. Wealthy families would be told that their departed loved ones were suffering in purgatory and could only be released through expensive masses and donations. Poor families would be offered cheaper options like group prayers and shared indulgences, but always with the implication that their poverty was itself a spiritual failing that required additional penance. The psychological manipulation involved in this system was sophisticated and cruel. Religious authorities learned to alternate between offering hope and threatening despair, keeping people in a constant state of anxiety about their spiritual status. They would promise salvation through one payment, then discover new spiritual problems that required additional fees. But the real innovation was the development of what we might call spiritual insurance. Instead of just selling forgiveness for past sins, the church began selling protection against future spiritual disasters. People could purchase indulgences that would cover sins they hadn't committed yet, spiritual protections that would shield them from demonic influence, and prayers that would guarantee divine favor during the next plague outbreak. This spiritual insurance created a subscription model for religious exploitation that could generate steady income indefinitely. People would pay regular fees to maintain their spiritual protection status, always afraid that cancelling their payments would leave them vulnerable to supernatural punishment. The most disturbing aspect of this religious corruption was how it turned human compassion into a luxury service. Before the plague, caring for the sick and dying had been seen as a basic Christian duty that everyone was expected to perform. After the plague, spiritual care became a professional service that required payment and credentials. Families who couldn't afford to hire proper religious authorities for dying relatives were told that this spiritual neglect would result in additional suffering for the deceased. The poor were essentially priced out of salvation, forced to watch their loved ones die without proper spiritual care, because they couldn't pay the fees that religious professionals demanded. This commodification of spiritual care created incentives for religious authorities to keep people spiritually dependent, rather than helping them develop their own relationship with the divine. Priests and monks learned that healthy spiritual communities were less profitable than anxious, dependent congregations who needed constant professional intervention. The educational functions that religious institutions had traditionally provided were also corrupted by this new economic model. Before the plague, monasteries and church schools had been centers of learning that preserved and transmitted knowledge for the benefit of entire communities. After the plague, religious education became a luxury service designed primarily to create more religious professionals who could extract resources from lay populations. Literacy, which had once been taught as a practical skill that enabled people to read religious texts for themselves, became carefully restricted to prevent lay people from developing independent spiritual understanding. Religious authorities realized that people who could read the Bible for themselves might notice that much of what they were being charged for wasn't actually required by Christian doctrine. This deliberate creation of religious ignorance was essential for maintaining the new exploitation model. People who understood their own religious tradition would be less likely to pay premium prices for spiritual services they could provide for themselves. Keeping lay populations ignorant and dependent was crucial for maximizing religious profits. The techniques used to maintain this ignorance were sophisticated and systematic. Religious services were conducted in Latin that most people couldn't understand. Theological explanations were deliberately made complex and confusing. Religious texts were kept in monastery libraries where ordinary people couldn't access them. Anyone who tried to develop independent spiritual understanding was accused of heresy and threatened with punishment. This religious information control created what we might call a spiritual protection racket, where religious authorities could charge whatever they wanted for services because people had no way to evaluate whether those services were actually necessary or effective. The psychological impact of this religious exploitation was devastating for plague survivors who were already struggling with trauma and grief. Instead of finding comfort and community in religious practice, they found themselves trapped in systems of spiritual extortion that added financial stress to their emotional suffering. Many people developed what we might now recognize as religious anxiety disorders, becoming obsessively worried about their spiritual status and constantly seeking reassurance from religious authorities who had financial incentives to keep them anxious. This created cycles of dependency that could persist for generations, as anxious parents passed their spiritual fears on to their children. The corruption also extended into the selection and training of religious professionals themselves. Instead of choosing clergy based on spiritual wisdom or pastoral care abilities, church hierarchies began prioritizing people who demonstrated skill at extracting money from congregations. The most successful priests and bishops were often those who were most effective at exploiting human psychological vulnerabilities. This created a religious leadership class that was fundamentally predatory rather than pastoral. These weren't necessarily evil people, but they were selected and rewarded for behaviors that prioritized institutional profit over individual spiritual welfare. The system systematically filtered out compassionate religious leaders while promoting those who could maximize revenue extraction. The training that these religious professionals received was specifically designed to teach psychological manipulation techniques rather than genuine spiritual guidance. They learned how to read individual and community vulnerabilities, how to calibrate fear and hope for maximum psychological impact, and how to structure payment systems that would extract maximum resources while keeping people dependent. This professional religious training also included sophisticated methods for deflecting criticism and avoiding accountability. Religious authorities learned to frame any questioning of their practices as spiritual rebellion that would result in damnation. They developed elaborate theological justifications for their exploitation that made it seem like charging high fees for spiritual services was actually a form of divine service. The political implications of this religious corruption were enormous. The church that emerged from the plague had unprecedented power to manipulate popular opinion and control social behavior through the systematic exploitation of spiritual anxiety. Political rulers quickly recognized that alliance with corrupt religious authorities could provide them with powerful tools for population control. This led to the development of what we might call theological authoritarianism, where political and religious power combined to create systems of social control that were far more effective than either could achieve independently. People who might resist political oppression could be controlled through threats of spiritual punishment, while those who might question religious authority could be suppressed through political force. The economic model that emerged from this church-state collaboration was incredibly profitable for both institutions. Religious authorities would provide ideological justification for political policies, while political authorities would enforce religious compliance through legal and military power. This created a feedback loop, where increasing authoritarianism in one sphere justified expanding control in the other. But perhaps the most lasting damage caused by this religious corruption was how it destroyed people's ability to find genuine spiritual meaning and community support during times of crisis. The religious institutions that should have helped people process their plague trauma instead exploited that trauma for financial gain, leaving survivors even more psychologically damaged than they had been before. This spiritual exploitation created what we might call a meaning crisis that persisted long after the plague itself had ended. People had lost faith not just in specific religious institutions, but in the entire possibility that spiritual life could provide genuine comfort and guidance, rather than just another form of exploitation and control. The techniques that had been developed to exploit religious anxiety during the plague became embedded in European Christianity so deeply that their influence persisted for centuries. The Protestant Reformation was partly a response to these corruptions, but even the Reformed churches often retained the basic model of professional religious authority, extracting resources from dependent lay populations. The psychological patterns of religious dependency and spiritual anxiety that had been created during the post-plague period became cultural templates that influenced how European civilization approached all forms of authority and expertise. People learned to distrust their own spiritual insights while simultaneously craving protection from religious professionals who claimed special access to divine knowledge. This created a model of social organization where professional classes could maintain power and extract resources by claiming exclusive access to essential knowledge while keeping ordinary people in states of ignorance and dependency. The religious exploitation that had emerged from plague trauma became the blueprint for how authority operated in post-medieval European society across multiple domains of human experience. The transformation of European legal systems after the Black Death reveals another dimension of this civilization-wide corruption that has been largely hidden from historical view. What emerged wasn't just a response to social chaos. It was the deliberate creation of legal complexity designed to transfer wealth and power from vulnerable populations to professional legal classes who understood how to exploit the new systems. Before the plague, most legal disputes in medieval communities were handled through relatively simple procedures that ordinary people could understand and participate in. Local customs were well known, procedures were transparent, and community members often served as judges and mediators. The legal system, while certainly not perfect, was at least comprehensible to the people it governed. The plague destroyed this accessible legal culture by killing many of the people who had carried traditional legal knowledge, and by creating unprecedented types of disputes that existing legal frameworks couldn't handle. Entire family lines had been extinguished, leaving property ownership unclear. Traditional inheritance patterns had been disrupted by mass death. Commercial relationships had been severed when business partners died. The legal challenges were genuinely complex and urgent, but the legal professionals who emerged to handle these challenges weren't primarily interested in creating just solutions to difficult problems. They recognized that legal complexity could be incredibly profitable if it was managed correctly. Instead of developing simple, transparent procedures for resolving plague-related disputes, they created deliberately complicated systems that required expensive professional interpretation. The techniques they used were sophisticated and systematic. Legal documents that had once been written in vernacular languages that ordinary people could read were now composed in specialized legal Latin that required professional translation. Simple procedures that communities had once handled informally were replaced with elaborate court rituals that required expert guidance. Straightforward concepts like property ownership were redefined using technical terminology that ordinary people couldn't understand. This legal mystification served multiple purposes. It created steady demand for expensive professional services. It prevented ordinary people from understanding their own legal rights and obligations. And it gave legal professionals enormous power to manipulate outcomes in favor of clients who could pay premium fees. The psychological manipulation involved in this legal corruption was particularly cruel because it exploited people's desperation to resolve urgent problems left by plague deaths. Families who were struggling to determine inheritance rights or business partnerships that needed to be dissolved couldn't afford to wait for simpler legal solutions to be developed. They needed immediate resolution, which gave legal professionals tremendous leverage to charge whatever the market would bear. Legal professionals learned to deliberately complicate straightforward cases in order to justify higher fees and longer proceedings. They would discover technical problems that required additional legal work, find precedents that suggested alternative interpretations, and create procedural requirements that necessitated multiple court appearances and document preparations. This artificial complexity creation was incredibly profitable because it turned simple legal problems into ongoing revenue streams. Instead of resolving disputes quickly and moving on to new clients, legal professionals could maintain relationships with the same clients for months or years while charging for continuous services. The most disturbing aspect of this legal corruption was how it created incentives for legal professionals to prevent rather than facilitate problem resolution. A resolved legal dispute was a former source of income, but an ongoing legal controversy was a steady revenue stream. Legal professionals learned to manage cases in ways that provided just enough progress to keep clients hopeful while ensuring that final resolution remained elusive. This led to the development of what we might call legal addiction, where people became dependent on ongoing professional legal services, even for relatively simple problems. They would continue paying legal fees long after the original dispute had become secondary to the legal process itself, trapped in systems they couldn't understand and couldn't afford to abandon. The economic model that emerged from this legal exploitation was sustainable precisely because it didn't depend on actually solving problems effectively. Legal professionals could maintain profitable practices by managing client expectations and controlling information flow, regardless of whether their clients achieved their original objectives. This corruption spread throughout the entire legal system, creating networks of mutual benefit among legal professionals who learned to refer complex cases to each other rather than developing simpler solutions that would eliminate the need for professional intervention. Courts became theatres for elaborate professional performances, rather than institutions for efficient dispute resolution. The long-term consequences for social justice were devastating. The legal system that emerged from the plague was fundamentally designed to benefit people who could afford expensive professional services while disadvantaging those who couldn't. This created a two-tiered system of justice where legal rights were effectively determined by economic resources rather than moral or factual merit. Or poor people found themselves essentially excluded from legal protection because they couldn't afford the professional services that the new legal system required. Wealthy people discovered that they could use legal complexity to avoid accountability for harmful actions by hiring professionals who could manipulate procedural requirements and exploit technical loopholes. This economic stratification of legal access became embedded in European legal culture so deeply that it seemed like a natural feature of legal systems rather than a specific historical development that had emerged from plague-era exploitation. The idea that legal rights should be proportional to economic resources became a foundational assumption that influenced European legal development for centuries. The psychological impact of this legal corruption was particularly severe for plague survivors who were already struggling with trauma and loss. Instead of finding justice and resolution through legal institutions, they often found themselves further victimized by systems that extracted their remaining resources while providing little actual help. Many people developed what we might now recognize as legal anxiety disorders, becoming obsessively worried about potential legal problems and constantly seeking reassurance from legal professionals who had financial incentives to keep them worried. This created cycles of dependency that could persist for generations as anxious families passed their legal fears on to their children. The corruption also extended into the training and selection of legal professionals themselves. Instead of choosing lawyers and judges based on wisdom, fairness, or problem-solving ability, legal institutions began prioritizing people who demonstrated skill at generating revenue from legal complexity. The most successful legal professionals were often those who were most effective at creating and exploiting legal confusion. This created a legal professional class that was fundamentally parasitic rather than productive. These weren't necessarily dishonest people, but they were selected and rewarded for behaviors that prioritized professional profit over social problem solving. The system systematically filtered out legal professionals who wanted to resolve disputes efficiently while promoting those who could maximize revenue extraction from legal complexity. The training that legal professionals received was specifically designed to teach complexity creation rather than problem resolution. They learned how to identify opportunities for procedural complications, how to research precedents that would support multiple interpretations, and how to structure legal arguments that would require extensive professional elaboration. This professional legal training also included sophisticated methods for deflecting criticism and avoiding accountability. Legal professionals learned to frame any questioning of their practices as attacks on the rule of law itself, making it seem like expensive legal complexity was essential for maintaining social order rather than a form of professional exploitation. The political implications of this legal corruption were enormous. The legal system that emerged from the plague gave unprecedented power to professional classes who could manipulate legal processes to serve their own interests while claiming to represent justice and social order. Political rulers quickly recognized that alliance with corrupt legal professionals could provide them with powerful tools for controlling populations while maintaining the appearance of legitimate governance. This led to the development of what we might call procedural authoritarianism, where political control was exercised through legal complexity rather than direct force. People who might resist obvious political oppression could be controlled through legal procedures that were too complicated to understand or challenge effectively. The economic model that emerged from this political legal collaboration was incredibly profitable for both professional classes. Legal authorities would provide procedural justification for political policies, while political authorities would enforce legal compliance through state power. This created a system where increasing legal complexity justified expanding political control, while political power protected legal professionals from criticism or reform. But perhaps the most lasting damage caused by this legal corruption was how it destroyed people's faith in the possibility of achieving justice through institutional means. The legal institutions that should have helped people resolve their plague-related problems instead exploited those problems for professional gain, leaving survivors even more vulnerable than they had been before. This legal exploitation created what we might call a justice crisis that persisted long after the plague itself had ended. People had lost faith not just in specific legal institutions, but in the entire possibility that legal systems could provide fair resolution of disputes rather than just another form of professional exploitation. The techniques that had been developed to exploit legal complexity during the plague became embedded in European legal culture so deeply that their influence persisted for centuries. Even legal reforms that claimed to simplify procedures often retained the basic model of professional legal authority extracting resources from dependent client populations. The psychological patterns of legal dependency and procedural anxiety that had been created during the post-plague period became cultural templates that influenced how European civilization approached all forms of institutional authority. People learned to distrust their own understanding of rules and procedures while simultaneously craving protection from professional authorities who claimed special access to institutional knowledge. This created a model of social organization where professional classes could maintain power and extract resources by claiming exclusive understanding of essential procedures while keeping ordinary people in states of confusion and dependency. The legal exploitation that had emerged from plague trauma became another blueprint for how authority operated in post-medieval European society. The transformation we've been exploring across medicine, agriculture, religion, and law represents something unprecedented in human history. The Black Death didn't just create a medical crisis or even a social crisis. It created the psychological and cultural conditions for the emergence of an entirely new form of civilization based on the systematic exploitation of human vulnerability and the monetization of basic human needs. This new civilization wasn't built on the ruins of the old one. It was built from the trauma and fear that the plague had embedded in survivors' minds. Every institution that emerged from the post-plague period was designed to exploit specific psychological vulnerabilities that had been created by the experience of watching medieval society collapse under the weight of mass death and social breakdown. The techniques that were developed during this period for turning human anxiety into professional profit became the foundational principles of what we now call Western civilization. The idea that basic human activities require expensive professional intervention, that ordinary people can't be trusted to understand or manage their own lives, and that institutional complexity is necessary for social order. All of these assumptions trace their origins back to the systematic exploitation of plague trauma. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this historical transformation is how successfully it has been hidden. The story of how the Black Death was used to create new forms of social control and professional exploitation has been buried in academic archives and dismissed as natural social evolution rather than recognized as the systematic manipulation that it actually was. Understanding this hidden history is crucial for recognizing similar patterns in our own time, when crises are still being used to justify the expansion of professional authority and the erosion of individual and community self-reliance. The legacy of the Black Death continues to shape how Western civilization responds to emergencies, organizes professional expertise, and structures the relationship between institutional authority and human autonomy. The secrets we've uncovered tonight reveal that the world we live in was literally built on the exploitation of medieval trauma, designed by people who understood how to turn human suffering into institutional power. These aren't just historical curiosities, they're the blueprints that still govern how our society operates today. And we're only beginning to scratch the surface of how deeply this transformation penetrated into the very fabric of human consciousness. The most chilling secret of the post-plague world wasn't just institutional corruption, it was the deliberate rewiring of human psychology itself. The survivors didn't just rebuild their world differently, they rebuilt themselves differently, creating new forms of human behavior that were specifically designed to serve the exploitative systems we've been exploring. Let me paint you a picture of what daily life actually looked like for someone living through this psychological reconstruction. Imagine you're a craftsman in a small town, maybe a blacksmith or a carpenter, someone who before the plague had been respected in your community, confident in your skills, secure in your place in the social order. The plague comes and goes, you survive, but everything you thought you knew about how the world works has been shattered. Now, you wake up every morning in a state of constant anxiety that your medieval ancestors would have found incomprehensible. You're afraid of your neighbors because you've learned they might abandon you or even turn violent if times get hard. You're afraid of your own body because you've been taught that illness is a moral failing that reflects your spiritual inadequacy. You're afraid of making decisions because you've been convinced that ordinary people like yourself can't be trusted with important choices. But here's where it gets really dark. These fears weren't natural responses to trauma. They were deliberately cultivated by the professional classes we've been discussing, because anxious, dependent people were much more profitable than confident, self-reliant ones. The psychological manipulation that created this new form of human consciousness was systematic, sophisticated, and absolutely ruthless. The techniques they used were based on what we might now call behavioral conditioning, though they wouldn't have used that terminology. They understood intuitively that human behavior could be shaped through the careful application of fear, hope, and social pressure. They learned to create psychological environments where the behaviors they wanted to encourage were rewarded, while the behaviors they wanted to discourage were punished. For example, people who questioned authority were labeled as dangerous troublemakers, who were probably infected with spiritual or moral corruption. Communities were encouraged to shun or even report anyone who expressed too much confidence in their own judgment, or who suggested that professional services might be unnecessary or overpriced. This created intense social pressure to conform to the new model of anxious dependence. Meanwhile, people who demonstrated appropriate levels of anxiety and deference to professional authority were rewarded with social approval and access to community resources. They were praised as wise and responsible citizens who understood the dangers of the post-plague world and were taking appropriate precautions to protect themselves and their families. This social conditioning was incredibly effective because it operated through peer pressure rather than direct coercion. People learned to police each other's behavior, creating communities where anyone who deviated from the approved patterns of anxiety and dependence would face immediate social consequences from their neighbors and family members. The psychological techniques used to maintain this conditioning were particularly sophisticated in how they exploited normal human emotional needs. Everyone needs to feel secure, valued, and connected to their community. The post-plague system promised to meet these needs, but only for people who demonstrated the correct attitudes of fearful dependence on professional authority. This created what we might call emotional extortion, where people's basic psychological needs were held hostage to ensure compliance with the new social order. You could have security, belonging, and self-worth, but only if you accepted your own incompetence and paid for professional services to manage your life. The most insidious aspect of this psychological manipulation was how it was disguised as education and moral improvement. People weren't told they were being conditioned to be anxious and dependent. They were told they were learning to be responsible, cautious, and spiritually mature. The very process of psychological manipulation was reframed as personal growth and social progress. Children were particularly vulnerable to this conditioning because they had no memory of how things had worked before the plague. They grew up thinking that constant anxiety about invisible threats was normal, that dependence on professional authority was natural, and that confident self-reliance was dangerous and irresponsible. Educational systems were specifically designed to reinforce these psychological patterns. Instead of teaching children practical skills and independent thinking, schools focused on teaching deference to authority and fear of making mistakes. Children learned that their own observations and reasoning were unreliable, that only trained experts could be trusted to interpret reality correctly. This educational conditioning created what we might call learned helplessness that persisted throughout people's lives. Adults who had been taught as children that they couldn't trust their own judgment became easy targets for professional exploitation because they genuinely believed they needed expert guidance for basic life decisions. The religious conditioning was equally systematic and even more psychologically damaging. Children were taught that their natural impulses and desires were fundamentally corrupt, that their own spiritual insights were probably demonic deceptions, and that salvation required constant professional mediation between themselves and the divine. This religious conditioning created deep psychological splits where people learned to distrust and fear their own inner experience while desperately craving external validation from religious authorities. They became psychologically dependent on professional spiritual guidance because they had been taught that their own relationship with meaning and transcendence was inherently unreliable and probably dangerous. The medical conditioning followed similar patterns, but focused on teaching people to fear and distrust their own bodies. Children learned that physical symptoms were probably signs of serious illness requiring immediate professional intervention, that their own sense of health and wellness was unreliable, and that prevention of disease required constant professional monitoring and expensive treatments. This medical conditioning created what we might now recognize as hypochondria, but in a culture that had been deliberately designed to reward and reinforce anxious preoccupation with health problems. People who constantly worried about their physical condition and sought frequent professional medical attention were seen as responsible and health-conscious, rather than neurotic and wasteful. The legal conditioning taught people that their own sense of fairness and justice was naive and dangerous, that legal problems required immediate professional intervention, and that attempting to resolve disputes through direct communication or community mediation was irresponsible and likely to make problems worse. This legal conditioning created populations that were afraid to handle their own conflicts and negotiations, making them dependent on professional legal services for interactions that their ancestors had managed successfully for centuries without any professional intervention at all. But perhaps the most damaging aspect of this psychological conditioning was how it destroyed people's ability to distinguish between genuine expertise and professional manipulation. By teaching people to distrust their own judgment while simultaneously creating complex systems that were deliberately difficult to understand, the post-plague professional classes made it nearly impossible for ordinary people to evaluate whether professional services were actually necessary or helpful. This created perfect conditions for what we might call expert capture, where professional classes could claim authority over any area of human experience by making it seem sufficiently complex and dangerous to require specialized knowledge. Once people accepted that they couldn't understand or manage a particular aspect of their lives, they became permanently vulnerable to exploitation by anyone who claimed relevant expertise. The economic conditioning was equally systematic, teaching people that their own economic judgment was unreliable, that financial planning required professional guidance, and that attempting to manage money independently was likely to result in disaster. This created markets for financial services that extracted wealth from people who had successfully managed their own economic affairs for generations. The agricultural conditioning convinced people that their own knowledge about food production was obsolete and dangerous, that farming required constant professional guidance, and that traditional agricultural methods were likely to result in crop failure and starvation. This made farming communities dependent on expensive agricultural services and products that they had never needed before. The craft conditioning taught artisans that their traditional skills were probably inadequate for post-plague conditions, that their products needed professional certification or enhancement, and that independent craftsmanship was likely to result in inferior goods that could harm customers. This created markets for professional services that added cost and complexity to production processes that had worked effectively for centuries. In every area of human activity, the same psychological pattern was repeated. Traditional confidence and competence were systematically undermined, while dependence on professional authority was reinforced through social pressure, economic incentives, and institutional requirements. The long-term psychological consequences of this conditioning were devastating for human autonomy and social cooperation. People who had been taught to distrust their own judgment and depend on professional authority for basic life decisions became psychologically incapable of the kind of independent thinking and community cooperation that had sustained human societies for thousands of years. This created what we might call a dependency cascade, where each generation became more psychologically dependent than the one before. As parents who had learned to distrust their own capabilities passed those anxieties onto their children, along with even more elaborate systems of professional dependence, the cultural impact was equally profound. European society became increasingly hierarchical and specialized, with complex networks of professional authorities controlling different aspects of human experience. But this wasn't just social organization. It was psychological organization, where people's inner lives became structured around the need for external validation and professional guidance. This psychological restructuring was so thorough and systematic that it became invisible to the people living within it. The post-plague Europeans didn't experience their dependence on professional authority as artificial conditioning imposed from outside. They experienced it as natural human psychology, as the normal way that reasonable people related to expertise and social institutions. This invisibility was crucial for maintaining the system because it prevented people from recognizing that their psychological patterns had been deliberately created rather than naturally developed. People who can't see that they've been conditioned can't resist or reverse that conditioning, making them permanently vulnerable to the systems that exploit their dependencies. The techniques that were developed during this period for creating psychological dependence became templates that were applied whenever social crises created opportunities for expanding professional authority. Every subsequent emergency, disaster, or social disruption became an occasion for further conditioning populations toward greater dependence on expert guidance and institutional control. This pattern of crisis exploitation became so embedded in European cultural DNA that it operated automatically whenever social stress created psychological vulnerability. Professional classes learned to recognize and capitalize on moments when people were most susceptible to conditioning toward greater dependence and institutional compliance. The Black Death had taught European civilization that human psychology was malleable, that social crises created opportunities for psychological manipulation, and that populations could be systematically conditioned to accept and even crave forms of authority that would have been rejected under normal circumstances. These lessons became foundational principles of Western institutional development, shaping how European societies responded to every subsequent crisis and challenge. The psychological conditioning techniques that had been developed to exploit plague trauma became standard tools for managing populations during wars, economic disruptions, religious conflicts, and political transitions. But the most disturbing aspect of this psychological legacy is how it created populations that were not just dependent on professional authority, but actively complicit in their own exploitation. People who had been conditioned to distrust their own capabilities and crave external validation became willing participants in systems that extracted resources and autonomy from them. This psychological complicity made the post-plague exploitation model incredibly stable and self-perpetuating. Unlike traditional forms of oppression that required constant external force to maintain, the psychological conditioning created internal motivations that made people want to participate in their own subordination. People genuinely believed that professional authority was protecting them from dangers they couldn't handle themselves, that institutional complexity was necessary for their safety and welfare, and that attempts to reduce dependence on expert guidance would result in personal and social disaster. This created what we might call Stockholm Syndrome at a civilizational level, where entire populations developed emotional attachments to the systems that exploited them, viewing challenges to professional authority as threats to their own security and well-being. The psychological patterns that were established during this period became so deeply embedded in European culture that they influenced every aspect of social, political, and economic development for centuries. The assumption that ordinary people needed professional guidance for basic life activities became a foundational premise of Western institutional design. Educational systems were organized around the idea that children needed to be taught dependence on expert authority rather than independent thinking and practical competence. Political systems were designed around the assumption that citizens needed professional management rather than direct participation in governance. Economic systems were structured to channel wealth toward professional classes who claimed to provide essential services that ordinary people couldn't provide for themselves. In every domain of human experience, the post-plague model of professional authority, extracting resources from dependent populations, became the template for how Western civilization organized itself. The trauma of the Black Death had been systematically exploited to create new forms of social organization that were fundamentally parasitic rather than productive. But the most chilling secret of all is how successfully this transformation has been hidden from historical consciousness. The story of how the Black Death was used to psychologically re-engineer European civilization has been buried so deeply that most people have no idea that their own psychological patterns and social institutions are products of systematic manipulation rather than natural human development. The behavioral conditioning, the institutional capture, the professional exploitation, the psychological dependency, all of it has been normalized to the point where it seems like the natural order of things rather than a specific historical artifact created by people who understood how to monetize human vulnerability and social crisis. Understanding this hidden history isn't just an academic exercise. These same techniques are still being used today whenever social crises create opportunities for expanding professional authority and institutional control. The playbook that was written during the post-plague period is still being followed, still being refined, still being applied to create new forms of dependency and exploitation. The legacy of the Black Death lives on in every institution that claims you need professional services for activities you could handle yourself, in every system that profits from your anxiety and dependence, in every authority that tells you that trusting your own judgment is dangerous and irresponsible. We're still living in the psychological prison that was built from the trauma of medieval plague survivors, still shaped by conditioning techniques that were designed to turn human beings into profitable sources of revenue for professional classes, who understood that scared, dependent people were much easier to exploit than confident, self-reliant ones. The secrets we've uncovered tonight reveal that our entire civilization was built on the systematic exploitation of human vulnerability, designed by people who understood that social crises could be used to psychologically re-engineer entire populations in ways that would benefit professional elites for generations to come. But there's still one more layer of this darkness that we need to explore, one final secret about how the Black Death transformed human nature itself in ways that continue to shape our world today. The psychological conditioning we've discussed was just the beginning. What came next was even more systematic, even more invasive, and even more lasting in its impact on human consciousness and social organization. In our next exploration, we're going to uncover how the post-plague professional classes didn't just exploit existing human psychology, they actually created new forms of human consciousness that had never existed before in history. They didn't just condition people to be dependent, they fundamentally altered how human beings understood themselves, their relationships, and their place in the world. The transformation we've been exploring was just the foundation for something much more ambitious and much more disturbing. The real secret of the Black Death isn't just that it created opportunities for exploitation, it's that it was used to launch the most successful psychological engineering project in human history, one that continues to shape every aspect of our lives today. But that's a story so dark and so comprehensive that it requires its own dedicated investigation. What we've covered tonight is disturbing enough, but it's nothing compared to what's still hidden in the deepest shadows of this medieval nightmare that became the blueprint for modern civilization itself. The psychological reconstruction project that emerged from the Black Death's aftermath represents the most systematic rewiring of human consciousness in recorded history. What the post-plague professional classes accomplished wasn't just behavioral modification, it was the creation of entirely new categories of human experience that had never existed before. They didn't just change how people acted, they changed how people thought about thinking itself. Let me walk you through how this worked, because the techniques they developed were so sophisticated that they make modern psychological manipulation look like amateur hour. The key insight that these medieval social engineers discovered was that human consciousness isn't fixed. It's malleable, especially when people are traumatized and desperate for meaning and security. And they learned to exploit this malleability with surgical precision. The first step was what they called reality fragmentation. Before the plague, most people had a relatively integrated sense of reality where their direct experience, community knowledge, and institutional authority generally aligned with each other. If something didn't make sense, people could trust their own observations, ask their neighbors, or consult traditional wisdom to figure out what was really happening. The post-plague system systematically destroyed this integrated reality and replaced it with competing sources of truth that contradicted each other in deliberate ways. Medical authorities would tell you one thing, religious authorities would say something different. Legal experts would provide a third interpretation, and your own experience would suggest something else entirely. This wasn't accidental confusion, it was engineered cognitive chaos designed to make people psychologically dependent on professional interpretation of reality itself. When you can't trust your own perceptions, can't rely on community knowledge, and can't reconcile competing expert opinions, you become desperate for someone to tell you what's really true. And that desperation could be monetized. The genius of this system was that it created what we might call manufactured uncertainty about things that had previously been straightforward. Simple questions like, am I healthy? Or, is this fair? Or, what should I do? Became complex problems requiring expensive professional consultation, because people had been taught that their own judgment about these matters was unreliable and potentially dangerous. But the really sophisticated part was how they embedded this uncertainty into the structure of thought itself. They didn't just teach people to doubt specific conclusions, they taught people to doubt their capacity for reaching conclusions at all. This created what we might call meta-dependency, where people became dependent not just on specific professional services, but on the entire concept of professional authority as the only reliable source of truth. This meta-dependency was crucial because it made the system self-perpetuating and expandable. Once people accepted that they couldn't trust their own reasoning processes, any area of human experience could be claimed by professional authorities simply by making it seem sufficiently complex or dangerous to require expert interpretation. The techniques they used to create this cognitive dependency were incredibly sophisticated. They would present people with problems that appeared to have obvious solutions, then reveal hidden complexities that made the obvious solutions seem naive or dangerous. This taught people that their initial instincts were probably wrong and that deeper professional analysis was necessary for any important decision. For example, a farmer might think that his crops looked healthy, but agricultural experts would explain that appearances could be deceiving and that invisible soil problems or plant diseases might be developing that only trained professionals could detect. A mother might think her child seemed fine, but medical authorities would describe subtle symptoms that untrained observers might miss and that could indicate serious underlying conditions. Over time, people learn to distrust their own perceptions and to immediately seek professional validation for observations that their ancestors would have handled confidently on their own. This created markets for professional services that existed solely to validate or invalidate people's own direct experience of reality. But the psychological manipulation went even deeper than cognitive dependency. The post-plague professional classes discovered that they could actually alter people's emotional relationship to their own autonomy and competence. They learned to make independence feel dangerous and dependence feel safe, turning normal human psychology completely inside out. The techniques they used were based on what we might now call trauma bonding, but applied at a social level. They would create artificial crises that made people feel vulnerable and afraid, then position themselves as the solution to problems they had created. Over time, people learned to associate professional authority with safety and self-reliance with danger. This emotional conditioning was particularly effective because it operated below the level of conscious thought. People didn't realize they were being conditioned to fear independence. They just gradually developed anxiety responses to situations where they had to rely on their own judgment. Meanwhile, they developed comfort responses to situations where professional authority was managing their decisions for them. The most disturbing aspect of this emotional conditioning was how it affected people's relationships with each other. The post-plague systems systematically undermined the social bonds that had traditionally provided people with emotional security and practical support. Communities that had once been sources of collective wisdom and mutual aid were transformed into networks of mutual surveillance and competitive anxiety. People learned to distrust their neighbors' advice and to be suspicious of anyone who seemed too confident in their own abilities. Community cooperation was reframed as potentially dangerous because untrained people working together might make mistakes that only professional supervision could prevent. This created social isolation that made people even more dependent on professional services for functions that communities had traditionally provided. The family structures were also systematically undermined. Traditional patterns of knowledge transmission from parents to children were disrupted by teaching people that older generations' wisdom was obsolete and potentially harmful. Children were taught to trust professional authorities more than their own parents, while parents were taught that raising children properly required constant professional guidance. This created what we might call generational dependency, where each generation became more reliant on professional services than the one before. Traditional family bonds were weakened while professional relationships were strengthened, creating new forms of social organization that were much more profitable for professional classes. The sexual and romantic relationships were also targets for professional intervention. The post-plague period saw the emergence of what we might call relationship expertise, where professional authorities claimed special knowledge about how intimate partnerships should function. People were taught that successful relationships required professional guidance, and that attempting to navigate romantic challenges independently was likely to result in emotional or spiritual damage. This created markets for professional services that had never existed before, while simultaneously undermining the informal support networks that had traditionally helped people through relationship difficulties. Instead of relying on family, friends, or community wisdom, people learned to seek professional counseling for problems that previous generations had handled through conversation and mutual support. But perhaps the most invasive aspect of this psychological reconstruction was how it altered people's relationship to their own inner experience. The post-plague professional classes discovered that they could claim authority over people's emotions, desires, and spiritual experiences by redefining these internal states as potentially pathological conditions requiring professional interpretation and treatment. Normal human emotions like grief, anger, fear, or joy were reclassified as symptoms that might indicate underlying disorders requiring professional intervention. Spiritual experiences that had once been considered natural parts of human consciousness were redefined as possible signs of mental instability or demonic influence that needed professional evaluation. This created what we might call experiential dependency, where people learned to distrust their own internal states and to seek professional validation for feelings and experiences that were actually normal parts of human consciousness. People became afraid of their own emotions and uncertain about their own spiritual experiences, making them dependent on professional authorities to tell them whether their inner lives were healthy or pathological. The economic implications of this psychological reconstruction were staggering. By claiming authority over people's thoughts, feelings, relationships, and spiritual experiences, the professional classes had essentially monetized human consciousness itself. Every aspect of inner life became a potential source of revenue through professional consultation and treatment services. This created what we might call a psychological economy, where human subjectivity was treated as a commodity that could be analyzed, diagnosed, treated, and managed through professional services. People's own minds and hearts became products to be consumed through expert interpretation, rather than resources to be trusted and developed through personal experience. The long-term consequences of this psychological colonization were devastating for human autonomy and social cooperation. People who had been taught to distrust their own thoughts and feelings became psychologically incapable of the kind of independent thinking and emotional self-regulation that had sustained human societies for millennia. This created populations that were not just economically dependent on professional services, but psychologically dependent on external validation for their most basic mental and emotional functions. People lost the ability to trust their own perceptions, regulate their own emotions, or find meaning in their own experiences without professional mediation. The cultural impact was equally profound. European society became organized around the assumption that human consciousness was inherently unreliable and potentially dangerous, that normal psychological functions required professional oversight, and that attempting to navigate inner life independently was irresponsible and likely to result in personal and social harm. This created institutional frameworks that were designed to intercept and redirect human psychological development through professional channels rather than allowing it to unfold through direct experience and community support. Educational systems, religious institutions, medical practices, and legal frameworks all became mechanisms for channeling human consciousness through professional interpretation rather than supporting its natural development. The most insidious aspect of this system was how it disguised psychological colonization as protection and care. People weren't told they were being stripped of their psychological autonomy. They were told they were receiving sophisticated help for complex problems that required expert attention. The process of psychological dependency was reframed as personal growth and social responsibility. This made resistance to the system extremely difficult because challenging professional psychological authority could be interpreted as evidence of the very mental instability that justified professional intervention. People who insisted on trusting their own psychological experience could be diagnosed as suffering from dangerous delusions of self-sufficiency that required immediate professional correction. The techniques that were developed during this period for managing human consciousness became templates that were applied whenever social conditions created opportunities for expanding psychological control. Every subsequent crisis became an occasion for further professional colonization of human inner experience. Wars, economic disruptions, religious conflicts, and political transitions all became opportunities for professional classes to claim authority over new areas of human psychology by arguing that traumatic circumstances required expert psychological management that ordinary people couldn't provide for themselves or each other. But the most lasting impact of this psychological reconstruction was how it created populations that were not just dependent on professional authority, but unable to conceive of alternatives to professional mediation of human experience. People who had been conditioned to distrust their own consciousness couldn't imagine functioning without external expert validation. This created what we might call psychological Stockholm syndrome, where entire populations developed emotional attachments to the systems that had colonized their inner lives. People genuinely believed that professional psychological authority was protecting them from mental and emotional dangers they couldn't manage independently. The idea that human consciousness might be inherently trustworthy, that emotions might be natural guidance systems rather than potential pathologies, or that spiritual experiences might be direct encounters with reality rather than symptoms requiring professional interpretation, became literally unthinkable for people who had been raised within the post-plague psychological framework. This psychological framework became so embedded in European culture that it influenced every aspect of social development for centuries. The assumption that human consciousness required professional management became a foundational premise of Western institutional design, shaping everything from educational curricula to religious practices to political systems. The techniques that had been developed for colonizing human psychology during the post-plague period became standard tools for managing populations during any kind of social stress or transition. Professional psychological authority became the primary mechanism through which institutional power was exercised over individual human experience. But the most chilling aspect of this historical development is how completely it has been erased from collective memory. The story of how human consciousness was systematically colonized by professional authorities has been so thoroughly buried that most people have no idea that their own psychological patterns are products of deliberate manipulation rather than natural human development. The dependency on external validation, the distrust of inner experience, the fear of psychological autonomy, the assumption that professional expertise is necessary for mental and emotional health. All of these patterns that seem like natural features of human psychology are actually historical artifacts created by people who understood how to monetize human consciousness through the systematic cultivation of psychological dependency. Understanding this hidden history reveals that what we consider normal human psychology is actually a form of psychological colonization that has been maintained for centuries through institutional frameworks designed to prevent people from developing trust in their own consciousness and confidence in their own psychological capabilities. As we reach the end of this dark journey through history's most carefully hidden secrets, I want you to sit with what we've uncovered together. The Black Death wasn't just a pandemic that killed millions and then faded into history books. It was the foundational trauma that created the world we still live in today. The psychological blueprint for a civilization built on exploiting human vulnerability and monetizing our deepest fears. Every institution that profits from your anxiety, every system that tells you to distrust your own judgment, every authority that claims you need professional guidance for things humans managed independently for millennia, all of it traces back to those dark years when medieval Europe's trauma was systematically weaponized by people who understood that scared, dependent populations were infinitely more profitable than confident, self-reliant communities. The most disturbing truth we've revealed tonight isn't just that this happened, it's that we're still living inside this psychological prison, still shaped by conditioning techniques designed to turn human beings into revenue streams for professional classes who discovered that our suffering could be harvested like a crop, generation after generation. But now you know. Now you've seen behind the curtain. And that knowledge, that awareness of how deeply we've been shaped by medieval trauma we never knew we inherited, that's the first step towards something different. The secrets of the Black Death don't have to remain buried forever. The patterns of exploitation don't have to continue indefinitely. Sweet dreams. And remember, the darkest truths often lead to the brightest awakenings.